There's this quiet tension that lives inside me, a subtle thread pulling tight whenever I try to reach out, to open up, to let someone in. It's like standing at the edge of a dark forest, wanting to step forward, but my feet feel rooted in place, my heart whispering warnings that something might be waiting ahead to hurt me. I've learned to keep a part of myself on watch, always scanning for signs, double-checking intentions, replaying conversations like a film I can't pause or stop. That restless vigilance has become second nature, an armor that feels both comforting and suffocating. I'm not alone in this. So often I hear people say, "I wish I could trust more," or "It's so hard to let go and just be vulnerable." But what's it really like inside that struggle? For me, trust never feels simple or pure. It's tangled with doubt, fear, and a constant internal debate. Is this safe? Am I going to regret this? Do they really mean what they say? I catch myself reading between every line, trying to decode unspoken messages, like a detective searching for clues that could confirm my suspicions before I even speak a word. Maybe you recognize that feeling, the urge to protect yourself before the pain even has a chance to arrive. What's tricky is that this hyper-awareness often hides behind what looks like caution or prudence. But really, it's a trembling finger hovering over a panic button that never gets pressed all at once, only flickering on and off with every interaction. I find myself circling around people, trying to connect, but never fully stepping in, keeping a distance just wide enough so I'm safe and just close enough so I don't feel completely alone. Sometimes it's exhausting. I crave connection, a genuine closeness, but every effort feels like walking on a tightrope. Any misstep might send me plummeting back into protectiveness or withdrawal. The problem is deeper than just being shy or guarded. It's like a loop inside my head that keeps replaying past disappointments and worst-case scenarios. The sting of betrayal, the ache of feeling misunderstood, or the quiet absence of reciprocity haunt my expectations. I prepare for these moments even before they come, building a mental fortress against potential heartbreak. The paradox? This fortress often keeps others out, too, turning the very thing I want most, connection, into something fragile or superficial. The relationships around me become drained of warmth, sometimes tense or brittle, because underneath the surface, I'm holding back pieces of myself that I'm too afraid to reveal. What's happened over time is that my instinct to protect turns into a barrier that isolates me. That delicate balance between guarding my heart and opening it up has shifted. Instead of safety, I sometimes find myself trapped in patterns of anxiety, where the need to control, predict, or anticipate every move grows restless and overwhelming. It makes every interaction feel like a test. Are they trustworthy? Will this end in disappointment? How should I act to avoid pain? These internal scripts run beneath my days and nights, even when, on the outside, I might be smiling, engaging, performing the role of someone who's fine. Connecting this truth to myself hasn't been easy. For years, I mistook my guardedness for strength or rational caution. And yet, the cost has been wearing invisibly on me, like a slow drip that eventually hollows out a rock. I want to feel safe to trust, really trust, without that voice inside me sharply ticking off reasons to hesitate. I want relationships that don't leave me drained or anxious. I want to feel that I'm seen, understood, and accepted, not in spite of my vulnerabilities, but because of them. This story I'm living, of wanting connection but wrestling with the anxiety that holds me back, feels so familiar and yet deeply personal. It's a quiet battle between longing and fear, between the hope for closeness and the habit of protection. I've started noticing how this tension shows up, the way I hesitate to share feelings, the nagging fear that I'll be let down again, the endless mapping of signs and signals and how others act. It's exhausting, yet so hard to step away from because it feels like survival. And here's the subtle thing I'm realizing. Trust isn't about naivety or tossing caution aside. It's something more intricate, rooted in feeling safe within ourselves first, something that breathing through this anxiety might someday let me build. But that's a journey, not a quick fix or a magical just trust command. There's a pace, a rhythm, an unfolding that I'm just beginning to understand. This path toward trust is a kind of reconciliation between my desire to connect and my need to protect, between my anxious mind and a steady heart. So as I stand here on this edge, Looking into the possibility of opening up more fully, I want to share what I'm learning. Not just the struggle, but also the small steps that feel like true progress. Because if any of this resonates, if you've ever felt this mix of hope and fear, this push and pull when it comes to trusting others, then maybe you and I can walk some of this path together. We don't have to let the anxiety keep defining us or the way we relate to those around us. There's a way forward, and it starts not with giant leaps, but with understanding the signs our anxiety shows us. Those subtle clues that trust isn't breaking down from lack of desire, but from a deep hunger for emotional safety that hasn't been met yet. This journey will take us through naming those signals, seeing the reasons behind them without judgment, and discovering how we can gently, steadily begin to open that guarded door. Because trust isn't about losing who we are. It's about becoming who we are meant to be, connected, courageous, and whole. And that possibility, just beyond the horizon, feels worth every step. There was a moment not long ago when I realized just how much my mind had become a battleground of silent alarms and cautious calculations. I was sitting with a close friend, someone I genuinely cared for, yet a part of me remained distant, as though watching from behind a glass wall. I wanted to speak honestly but hesitated, fearing my openness might be met with judgment or indifference. That hesitation wasn't born from ignorance. It was a hardened reflex shaped by countless times I'd pushed too far, only to recoil when the warmth I sought turned cold. What surprised me most in that moment was how exhausting the effort to hold back had become, a subtle weight pressing me into a smaller, quieter version of myself. Unlike before, I began to observe this tendency not as a flaw, but as a response shaped by survival. The protection mechanism I still carried was a complex tapestry woven from old wounds and lessons learned in vulnerability's harsh classrooms. I understood that these internal signals often masquerade as prudence, but beneath the surface, they signal an unmet need for emotional steadiness, a calm harbor rather than a stormy sea. What felt different was identifying these subtle patterns as distinct from my identity, as habits that could be unpacked and eased rather than innate truths I had to endure indefinitely. There's a deeper layer to this dynamic that I hadn't fully acknowledged, the intricate dance between my nervous system and my desire for connection. During moments when suspicion crept in, I noticed my breathing grew shallow, my muscles tensed, and my chest tightened. It was as if my body had memorized a script where vulnerability meant danger. What I hadn't realized was how much my body's state can dictate the openness of my heart. When my nervous system thrums with tension, it effectively locks the doors to emotional closeness. But when I find even a sliver of ease, an unguarded sigh, a softened gaze, or a grounding breath, the possibilities for genuine engagement begin to expand. I began experimenting with small practices to invite this ease more consistently. One evening, after a long day, I sat quietly in my room, focusing solely on the rhythm of my breath. The intention wasn't to solve anything, but simply to witness the ebb and flow inside me, allowing tension to release without judgment. Gradually, I felt a gentle uncoiling, a loosening of some invisible ties that had constricted my ability to be present with others. That simple act didn't erase my wariness, but it cracked open a door I didn't realize had sealed so tightly. A space where vulnerability could arrive incrementally, rather than all at once. To help this process, I created a personal ritual of checking in with my physical sensations before engaging in meaningful conversations. For example, if I sensed the familiar tightness creeping in, I would pause, place a hand on my chest, and say to myself, "I am safe enough to be here." This wasn't a naive chant, but a deliberate grounding tool to soothe the rapid-fire thoughts that often pulled me away before real emotional exchange could begin. Over time, these moments of self-reassurance became a bridge between my inner world and the exterior connection I sought, gently rewiring my responses from hypervigilance toward openness. One afternoon, I met with a colleague whose demeanor I found uneven and distant. Usually, someone displaying coldness would trigger my instinct to retreat, to brace for rejection. But that day, I paused and noted the tightness brace forming in my muscles. Instead of shutting down, I allowed myself to stay curious, wondering what insecurities or fears he might be carrying that shaped his behavior. This shift hardly guaranteed an immediate bond, but it eased the edge in my chest and opened a new way of relating, not as a fortress against possible hurt, but as an explorer willing to sit with uncertainty and discomfort. It was a powerful reminder that the path to connection isn't a straight line, but a series of weathered moments where patience and empathy take root. There's also something radical about reclaiming control, not by tightening our grip, but by choosing when to loosen it, bit by bit. I found that genuinely meaningful exchanges happened when I accepted that vulnerability isn't synonymous with exposing all parts of myself at once. Instead, it resembles a slow dance where trust unfolds cautiously, like the petals of a flower opening only when sunlight feels right. By acknowledging this natural tempo, I could quiet the inner critic demanding instant reassurance and instead nurture kindness toward my own pace and limits. I recall a conversation with someone special where I tested this approach. We were walking along a quiet street, and rather than throwing out all my thoughts in one surge, I shared a small, carefully chosen feeling, something tender and real but manageable. Her response was gentle and receptive, reflecting back a space of acceptance that I wasn't used to encountering so immediately. That evening I realized that the way we build connection is not through grand declarations or leaps of faith, but through these small acts of courage, the willingness to be seen in fragments first and gradually as a whole. Building on this, I started to recognize that genuine emotional safety often transcends words. Sometimes, it's in a lingering glance, a touch, or a shared silence where mutual respect and care seed themselves quietly. This physical embodiment of security allows us to show up more authentically over time. Now, consider how this applies when you find yourself skirting close to the edge of openness but pull back. Notice how subtle shifts in your posture or breath can either invite warmth or reinforce distance. The body remembers safety long before the mind catches up, and honoring that can be revolutionary. Through these experiments and insights, I began to replace rigid expectations of what connection should look like with a more fluid understanding. That layers of protection are not enemies, but signals telling me when to pause and when to embrace. The challenge, and promise, is to learn how to listen to these cues without letting them keep me from stepping into meaningful intimacy. There is a kind of tenderness that emerges when I treat these defenses not as barriers to climb, but as doorways to negotiate at my own rhythm. In this way, the story I live is not one of fixed limitation, but ongoing exploration. A journey where vulnerability and security don't oppose each other, but weave together into a textured fabric of healing. I'm picking up the thread slowly, allowing myself to feel the subtle shifts as they come, trusting that even the smallest openings can grow into powerful connections. This delicate balance transforms isolation into companionship not by magic, but by the quiet work of attunement to my body, my feelings, and the world around me. I remember a night when I found myself sitting alone on a park bench, the cool breeze brushing against my skin and stars scattered across the sky like unspoken promises. My phone lay forgotten in my lap, not because I was distracted, but because for once, I wanted to feel the stillness inside me. Up until that moment, my mind had been like a tangled web of what-ifs, a labyrinth of apprehensions weaving stories about the people I cared about. That night, I realized the endless mental rehearsals had been exhausting, but more importantly, they hadn't brought me any closer to feeling secure. They only magnified the distance between my desire for closeness and the reality I lived. I began to consider how much I had been conditioned to expect disappointment before it happened, as if bracing myself for storms that might never arrive. This habitual foresight, meant to shield me, had paradoxically dimmed my capacity to savor genuine moments with others. Reflecting on this, I saw that my mind's habit of scanning for hidden cues and potential risks is similar to a watchtower constantly scanning the horizon, never allowing the gates to lower fully. However, this vigilance came at a cost. It confined me to observation instead of participation, where I became a spectator in my own attempts at intimacy. One day, a conversation with a friend illuminated something new. She told me about her experience with grounding exercises that involved tuning into sensory details, feeling the texture of a fabric, the scent of coffee, or the warmth of sunlight on skin, and how these helped her interrupt the avalanche of anxious thoughts. I was skeptical at first, convinced that the fight in my mind was too stubborn for simple tricks like that. Yet, as I gave it a try, I noticed how redirecting my attention from my swirling thoughts to concrete sensations created brief pockets of relief. It was as if by inviting my senses to take the lead, my anxious mind was temporarily sidelined, allowing space for calm to register in my body. This sensory approach soon became a quiet ally in moments when I felt overwhelmed by mistrust. During a tense family gathering, for example, instead of spiraling into analyzing every glance or silenced word, I focused on feeling the cool weight of the glass in my hand and the softness of the chair beneath me. That shift grounded me. Though the anxiety didn't vanish entirely, it softened enough for me to engage more sincerely and with less defensive reflex than usual. I began to understand that moments of connection often germinate not in grand gestures, but in subtle invitations to our bodily awareness. Equally illuminating was the discovery that my relationship with self-compassion directly influenced my ability to extend trust to others. I recall a time I harshly judged myself for being too sensitive, blaming that sensitivity for the wall I maintained. However, embracing gentleness towards my own imperfections gradually loosened layers of self-reproach. One afternoon, as I journaled without censorship, I allowed myself to confront the long-buried fears that I wasn't adequate enough, that my acceptance hinged on flawless performance. Writing those thoughts down felt like silently unburdening my shoulders. It was the first step toward dismantling the belief that I had to be invulnerable to deserve closeness. This newfound kindness inside transformed how I navigated relationships. No longer did I chase elusive perfection or anticipate inevitable failure. Instead, I practiced embracing uncertainties, including the bittersweet truth that imperfection is something all humans share. Now, when I felt the urge to question someone's intentions, I paused and gently reminded myself that my anxieties didn't necessarily mirror reality, but whispered echoes from past experiences. Reframing mistrust as an old pattern rather than an absolute truth gave me greater latitude to interact without the edges of suspicion that had previously sharpened every encounter. An unexpectedly profound lesson came through an encounter with a stranger on a train. She offered a simple smile, and for reasons I can't fully explain, that warmth stirred something inside me. I realized that the way we perceive safety isn't always constructed from logical assurances, but often through fleeting yet tangible moments of human connection, shared glances, smiles, or small acts of kindness that speak to a deeper resonance inside us. This understanding prompted me to appreciate that trust can blossom from these seemingly inconsequential touches, nurtured by the recognition that beneath all our facades, we long to be known and held. Building on this insight, I started listening more closely to how trust grows incrementally, akin to planting seeds and tending to them patiently instead of expecting a sudden bloom. I approached my friendships and partnerships with an openness to gradual unfolding, taking cues from the subtle shifts in energy and responsiveness. When I offered a thought or a vulnerability, I paid attention to whether it was met with curiosity, respect, or calm receptivity. These moments were signposts, guiding me in deciding how deeply I could safely engage without overwhelming myself. Now, consider how this applies when you face situations that once left you paralyzed by anxiety, such as sharing a personal truth with someone new or affording them the benefit of the doubt. What new habit might you cultivate today to invite a small sense of safety into these exchanges? Could it be pausing to identify a physical sensation that signals security? Or perhaps practicing a brief acknowledgement of compassion toward your unease? These choices aren't about ignoring doubts, but about creating a foundation where your spirit can lean in without losing its balance. In embracing these subtle, embodied experiences, I found that the journey toward trust deepens beyond intellectual understanding and taps into a wisdom held in the quiet spaces of our being. This approach transforms what felt like a constant struggle into a series of manageable, meaningful steps, each opening a little more room for connection and healing. It's within these moments, often unseen and unscripted, that trust truly begins its vital work, threading security through the fabric of our daily lives. One afternoon, I found myself at a bustling cafe, sharing a table with a colleague I barely knew. Normally, such encounters left me guarded, rehearsing scripts in my head to shield myself from unexpected judgments or disappointments. Yet this time, I noticed an unusual stirring inside, a cautious curiosity that encouraged me to listen without immediately plotting my defenses. Our conversation meandered unexpectedly into vulnerabilities he shared about his own fears, and although a nervous tremor whispered warnings, I allowed myself to absorb his honesty without scanning for hidden agendas. Later that day, I reflected on how rarely I'd permitted myself this degree of open engagement with strangers. The experience illuminated a fresh revelation. Trust doesn't demand an all-in leap, but offers opportunities to let down fragments of armor incrementally, embedded within shared authenticity. The complex dynamics of connection extend beyond fear and protection. They include moments of genuine recognition that defy my protective programming. One evening, I decided to explore this notion more deliberately by setting a personal boundary during a phone call with a close friend. Previously, my default response would have been to acquiesce immediately, fearing rejection or conflict if I expressed discomfort. Instead, I spoke my needs clearly, stating, "I need some space right now to process," and waited silently for her reaction. To my surprise, she responded with empathy and understanding, creating an emotional current that softened my usual apprehension. This interplay revealed a powerful truth. Asserting my limits can paradoxically foster deeper trust because it communicates respect for both myself and others. Around the same time, I took notice of how my physical environment influenced my openness to connection. In rooms suffused with soft natural light and the faint scent of cedarwood, I felt less compelled to fortify my emotional walls. Contrastingly, crowded, noisy places ignited an almost reflexive withdrawal, compelling me to shrink inward. This discovery propelled me to cultivate spaces, not just physically, but within my mental landscape, that invited safety and calm. It became clear how integral the atmosphere is in either nurturing or stifling the ability to extend trust, reinforcing that such gestures require fertile ground. An unexpected breakthrough unfolded during a weekend retreat focused on mindful movement. Initially skeptical, I entered the practice with hopes for relaxation but little expectation of emotional insight. As I engaged in slow, deliberate motions, synchronizing breath with movement, I felt layers of tension embedded deep within my muscles begin to unravel. The practice revealed how tightly held emotional apprehensions could manifest corporeally. More importantly, through consistent return to mindful postures, I glimpsed how enhancing awareness of my body's messages can signal readiness to embrace connection, revealing a new language of trust that transcends thought alone. On another occasion, a quiet exchange with my younger sibling surfaced hidden dimensions of my guardedness. We sat side by side, silent but linked by a shared presence. Without words, I sensed an invitation to lower my defenses by simply allowing myself to be known without expectation. It was in that shared stillness that I first tasted what unconditional acceptance felt like in action, not as an ideal but a lived encounter. The potency of presence became a beacon, guiding me away from habitual preemptive skepticism toward a gentle willingness to receive and give emotional safety. I also started to recognize patterns in how my anticipation of disappointment skewed interpretations of others' behaviors. For instance, when a friend canceled plans last minute, instead of defaulting to imagining neglect or rejection, I trained myself to ask, what else might be happening here? This curious stance, though initially awkward, blossomed into a transformative exercise of releasing need for certainty. It didn't make unpredictability effortless, but it reframed experiences from threats to puzzles awaiting compassionate inquiry. One vivid nighttime encounter heightened my awareness of trust's complexity. Walking home alone after a late shift, I noticed a familiar impulse to quicken my steps, fueled by imagined dangers lurking in the darkness. But consciously, I slowed my pace, aligning each footfall with a steadying breath. In that stillness, I detected a subtle recalibration, one that acknowledged risk without surrendering to paralyzing fear. This choice embodied trust not as disregard for vulnerability, but as a courageous embrace of uncertainty in movement and life. These unfolding realizations continue to shape the evolving landscape of my connections. I'm learning to distinguish between protective instincts that signal genuine danger and those that echo unexamined fears. Acknowledging this difference empowers me to decide when to engage and when to step back, not as rigid absolutes, but as flexible, moment-to-moment dance partners in the choreography of relationship. This emerging flexibility gifts me with freedom to experience others with less suspicion and more openness. Reflecting on all this, I realize that trust can be cultivated through intentional attentiveness to both inner signals and outer cues. It invites me to embark on an ongoing practice of balancing awareness with receptivity, fostering dialogues between my cautious heart and my yearning for connection. By anchoring myself in authentic encounters that honor limits and encourage growth, I move toward a state where trust becomes less a leap and more a patient unfolding, a canvas painted with countless brushstrokes of courage, curiosity, and mutual respect. There was a time when I found myself pulling back from someone I cared about, not because I didn't want closeness, but because my mind was racing through invisible mazes of what-ifs and maybes. Yet, unlike before, that withdrawal felt less automatic. It was a conscious choice tinged with frustration. The difference was subtle but important. I was beginning to discern how much my nervous system clung to tension as a false security and how much I longed to release that grip. I realized that holding on to discomfort masqueraded as control, but in truth, it only tightened the chains I yearned to break. One night, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling's cracked paint, I started replaying an argument with my sibling. I had argued fiercely, trying to make my feelings clear, but somewhere along the way, I retreated into sarcasm and silence, building walls that neither of us could cross. What I hadn't faced then was the hidden cost of that silence. How echoing doubts and unspoken fears warped my self-image and distorted my understanding of others' intentions. This realization felt like stepping into a shadowy room and switching on the light. Painful at first, but revealing spaces to heal. I noticed how my body often mirrored these unspoken struggles through subtle signals, shallow breaths, clenched jaws, or a heavy weight pressing against my chest. Learning to listen to these indicators became a turning point. Instead of trying to push the uneasy feeling away or interpret it as weakness, I began experimenting with compassionate inquiry, asking myself, what is this sensation telling me right now? In learning to translate these physical cues, I discovered an intimate dialogue with my inner landscape, one that respected the voice beneath anxiety's volume. The practice of greeting discomfort with curiosity brought unexpected gifts. During a weekend walk through a quiet forest, I stumbled upon a small, weathered bench bathed in dappled sunlight. As I sat and observed birds weaving between branches, a wave of poignant clarity washed over me. The birds accepted the unpredictable winds, adjusting their flight with grace and resilience. I wondered whether I could learn from them, to bend without breaking, to navigate the turbulence without losing my course. It was an invitation to move beyond rigid defenses and explore fluid forms of inner strength. More concretely, I started creating safe boundaries through small acts of self-affirmation that honored my capacity without overwhelming it. For instance, before engaging in conversations that felt emotionally charged, I would pause, grounding myself with a phrase, "I'm open for this moment, as much as I can be." This simple acknowledgement shifted the internal narrative from one of all-or-nothing trust to one where partial opening felt courageous and sufficient. Over time, the accumulative effect of these mini choirs of safety helped build a rhythm of trust calibrated to my natural tempo. One afternoon, I met someone new at a workshop. She radiated calm confidence, speaking gently yet with conviction about her personal journey through anxiety and connection. When she shared a story about learning to embrace uncertainty as a path with no map, I resonated deeply. It was a perspective that reframed expectations entirely. Instead of needing guarantees of safety, she learned to rely on her internal compass, constantly adjusting course and finding landmarks in unexpected places. This metaphor lingered with me like a seed planted in fertile soil, suggesting that real security might emerge not from eliminating risk, but from fostering adaptability. A few weeks later, I tested this outlook in a vulnerable situation. I confessed a recent failure to a close friend, the first time I shared a personal mistake without rehearsing excuses or downplaying its impact. As I spoke, my heart hammered, but her response was steady and kind, inviting me to be more honest without fear. I realized how freeing it felt to share shortcomings and witness acceptance unshaken by perfection. The experience was a pivotal crack in the internal dam, signaling the possibility of creating true dialogue beyond guarded postures. At home, I began to notice patterns in how my environment affected my alertness and receptivity. Clear spaces with natural textures, soft lighting, and minimal noise nourished a sense of serenity that encouraged me to sit with discomfort rather than flee. Conversely, cluttered or chaotic rooms stirred apprehension and a tightness I hadn't consciously connected to my ability to relax emotionally. Recognizing this ecological relationship inspired me to curate surroundings supportive of openness, extending the internal work into the design of daily life. Through these interconnected discoveries, I've realized that learning to trust more fully involves not just changing thoughts, but embracing a multifaceted orchestration of body, mind, and environment. It requires blending firmness with pliability, embedding vulnerability within structures of self-care, and cultivating patience for the nonlinear journey. Now, consider how you might invite this rich interplay into moments where old fears still whisper. Could you engage your senses deliberately, create physical spaces that nurture ease, or experiment with small openings without judgment? Each of these steps invites a tapestry of new possibilities, crafting a pathway forward that honors where you are today while gently beckoning toward growth. Lately, I've found myself caught in a strange paradox. I crave connection fiercely, yet I sometimes sabotage it without even meaning to. It's like standing at the edge of a glass bridge, feeling the pull to cross, yet hesitating because the surface seems too fragile to hold me. What's been unfolding for me is the discovery that this barrier isn't just built from fear, but from an intricate web of unmet needs and unspoken stories that shaped my definition of safety. During a late-night conversation with a longtime friend, I shared this vulnerability openly, and her response surprised me. Instead of urging me to just trust or push past it, she acknowledged the complexity of my experience and posed a simple question. What would safety look like for you if it weren't tied to protecting yourself all the time? Her inquiry lingered in my mind like a quiet melody. It urged me to step back and examine the unseen architecture of my emotional defenses. I noticed that beneath my reservations, there was a yearning not just to avoid hurt, but to be witnessed in my fullness, the messy, contradictory parts included. This wasn't about naivety or recklessness. It was about developing a sanctuary inside that could withstand storms without sealing itself off. This internal refuge, I began to understand, requires active nurturing and patience rather than mere suppression of anxious impulses. Sometimes, I liken this process to tending a delicate garden hidden deep in a forest. The fragile seedlings, my moments of openness, need light, nourishment, and protection from harsh winds. If I rush the growing season, pulling weeds too harshly or exposing plants prematurely, I risk stunting their growth. Similarly, I've come to appreciate that emotional safety isn't a fixed condition, but a dynamic environment I cultivate through careful observation and gentle adjustment. Another evening, while attending a small community gathering, I observed how subtle changes in my posture could either escalate my unease or invite a sense of calm. For instance, curling my hands into fists or crossing my arms often tightened the walls around me, whereas relaxing my shoulders and letting my breath deepen seemed to soften the invisible barriers. It struck me that trust might begin not in the mind, but in the body's willingness to relax enough to let another human presence in. This somatic awareness revealed a new tool for connection, using my senses as guides rather than allowing my anxious mind to dominate. On a different note, I encountered a situation where my instinct to analyze and control interactions felt overwhelming. During a team meeting, I caught myself dissecting every comment, watching for hidden agendas or signs of disapproval. The energy in the room felt thick with tension, and my mind spun scenarios spiraling into potential rejection. However, I paused to acknowledge this spiraling without judgment, imagining it as static noise that clouded an otherwise clear signal. Then, I asked myself what might happen if I simply accepted the moment as imperfect, opening myself to learning rather than anticipating defense. This mental pivot didn't erase my anxiety instantly, but it diminished its power enough to let genuine curiosity take the lead. Reflecting on this, I saw parallels between my inner experience and a novice dancer learning to follow rhythm rather than fighting it. I'm still stumbling and sometimes rushing ahead or freezing in place, but each stumble teaches me more about timing, balance, and trust in the flow. I realize now that patience with myself is foundational when attempting to build emotional security. It's not a linear climb, but a spiral, circling closer to presence with every imperfect turn. I remember a moment when vulnerability felt tangible, a rare smile shared between me and a stranger during a crowded subway ride. Our eyes locked just long enough to acknowledge shared weariness, and in that brief exchange, I sensed an unspoken pact that each of us was quietly seeking connection beyond the noise. This tiny encounter challenged my habitual wariness and shifted my awareness. If human connection can spark spontaneously and authentically in such ephemeral moments, perhaps I don't need to architect perfect conditions before I allow myself to engage more deeply elsewhere. The journey continues with questions instead of answers. When I'm tempted to tread back into suspicion or control, I try to ask myself, what gentle action can I take to meet my impulse with care instead of resistance? How might I invite softness into a relationship without losing my boundaries? These reflections become invitations rather than demands, easing the tension between caution and trust. In embracing this nuanced perspective, I recognize that cultivating relationships is less about conquering inner fears and more about befriending them, acknowledging their presence, and whispering reassurance that I can withstand discomfort without erasing my longing for closeness. Some days are marked by progress, others by retreat, but the constant thread is a deepening dialogue between my vulnerability and my courage. This unfolding conversation beckons me to stand at the glass bridge again, each time with a steadier step and a heart more willing to find strength in uncertainty. Reflecting on this journey so far, I notice a quiet unfolding within me, like a river gradually carving its way through stubborn rock, each current reshaping the landscape in subtle, persistent ways. The interplay between my inner world and the outer relationships I seek feels less like a battle and more like a delicate choreography, where tension and surrender weave together in rhythm. It's as if I've been carrying a fragile vessel across shifting terrain, learning to steady my hands and adjust my grip in response to the stones and the swells beneath my feet. This process has invited me into spaces where vulnerability is less a leap into the abyss and more a cautious approach to a horizon slowly illuminated by dawn's first light. I remember sitting on the edge of a quiet lake one morning, the water's surface a near mirror reflecting the awakening sky. The stillness there whispered something profound. That presence comes not through forcing clarity, but by allowing the ripples to settle naturally. In that moment, I sensed the contours of my experience blending together, not as isolated obstacles or victories, but as strands of a deeper thread connecting me to myself and others. It wasn't about stewarding perfection or eradicating fear, but about discovering how to hold the tension between my longing and my reluctance in a way that honors both. Our minds often race ahead, building castles from shadows cast by old memories or imagined futures. But I've begun to realize that the true terrain of our relationships grows from the soil beneath these illusions, soft, fertile, and sometimes uneven. Navigating this terrain requires more than intellectual insight. It calls for a felt sense, a tuning in to the whispers beneath our surface selves. Each time I lean into that subtle attunement, I feel the edges of my carefully constructed defenses soften, making room for a gentler, more supple openness to emerge. It's a dance of ebb and flow, not a static state, inviting me to move with grace through uncertainty and tenderness. In conversations both casual and intimate, I've become increasingly aware of a silent dialogue happening beneath spoken words, the body's exhalations, the brief flicker of an eye, the slight tension in a smile. These undercurrents speak volumes, revealing truths that often elude our conscious grasp. A glance exchanged across a crowded room can carry the weight of unsaid fears and unspoken hopes. Learning to discern these subtle cues feels like learning a new language, one that honors nuance and mystery instead of demanding certainty. This shift has given me permission to slow down, to inhabit the spaces between thoughts and words, where understanding quietly takes root. I think of how often I have bounded forward with urgent desires only to be met with resistance that felt like a wall, pushing me back into familiar patterns of self-protection. Yet, through tenderness and repeated encounters with uncertainty, I find cracks appearing, spaces where light and warmth seep through the smallest fissures. These openings are earned, not granted, emerging from patience with myself and others as we traverse the uneven ground of trust building. They remind me that the journey isn't to conquer barriers, but to weave paths around and through them with intention and care. Sometimes, I feel like a gardener tending a wild patch. There is beauty in the unpredictability, but it demands attentiveness and a willingness to adapt. I am learning to recognize when to nourish new growth and when to step back and observe quietly, acknowledging that some seeds require time beyond what I can impose. This deepening attunement requires relinquishing control over timing and outcome, a surrender that paradoxically strengthens my roots rather than diminishing them. As I carry these reflections forward, I realize the terrain ahead is less unknown wilderness and more an intimate landscape unfolding under my feet. The tension between wanting to safeguard myself and the desire to share openly no longer stalls me, but propels me toward a rhythm marked by curiosity and resilience. It feels less like a fixed destination and more an evolving expression of presence, a breath held and released, that invites me to meet life's inherent uncertainties with both caution and courage. In this space, the possibilities for transformation stir quietly beneath the surface, waiting to be invited forth. The strands of doubt, hope, and yearning entwine to form a tapestry larger than any single moment or feeling. It's becoming clear that what we seek is not the absence of all fear, but a way to move through it with grace, aligning our steps with the tender pulse of our own becoming. I once stood beneath an ancient oak, its branches stretching wide like outstretched arms inviting me to rest. I remember the coolness of the shade, the gentle rustle of leaves above, and the way my breath slowed, settling into a quiet rhythm I'd almost forgotten I possessed. In that stillness, a truth unfurled itself gently within me, not about fixing or conquering fear, but about learning to coexist with it, allowing space for fragility alongside strength. It was as if the tree itself embodied resilience, rooted deeply in unpredictable soil, swaying with the wind, yet unwavering in its presence. I realized then that carrying safety isn't a task of eliminating doubt or pain, but cultivating a sanctuary inside my own skin, one where I can lean into connection while honoring the protective currents beneath. That image returned to me on nights when my mind would spiral, racing ahead to scenarios I hoped to avoid. I realized I had been holding my breath through those moments, as though tension were a shield strong enough to deflect all harm. Yet tension alone never offered relief. What began to shift was my willingness to invite my own vulnerability as a companion instead of an enemy, to sit with the rawness without judgment, to listen deeply when parts of me whispered caution, and to answer with kindness rather than resistance. It dawned on me that security could be found within this tender embrace, a refuge not imposed from outside, but gently built by my own presence. As I navigated the delicate dance of opening to others, I noticed the paradox that true connection often emerges in spaces where courage and uncertainty intersect. It wasn't about a seamless flow or perfect understanding, but about the willingness to show up nonetheless. I discovered that when I allowed my imperfections and hesitations to surface, without editing or apology, I invited others to do the same. Those moments, imperfect and uneven, often became the richest soil from which authentic bonds grew. It was as if the walls I had painstakingly constructed needed to be softened before bridges could form. One afternoon, I sat with a friend who shared a quiet admission about her own fearful tangles with trust. There was no grand epiphany in our conversation, only the comfort of mutual recognition, a silent acknowledgement that this path is neither swift nor linear. Together, we held the paradox of wanting to reach out while recoiling, of desiring closeness but guarding ourselves fiercely. That companionship, rooted in shared humanity, revealed a profound truth. We are not broken for feeling wary, nor flawed for proceeding with caution. Our hesitations are part of the narrative, winding threads woven into the larger fabric of connection. The journey taught me that the kindest way forward isn't pushing beyond my limits brutally or shrinking from risk entirely. Instead, it's a choreography of incremental risk-taking, where I gently test boundaries, listen to my inner signals, and return repeatedly to my own center. In those measured steps, I reclaim agency over how and when I expose my inner world. Security arises less as an external guarantee and more as an internal rhythm, a pulse that guides me through uncertainty with steady resolve. There are days when I still feel the old impulse to barricade myself against potential hurt. Those moments aren't failures but the echoes of survival, urging me to be gentle with my own process. What has changed is the recognition that in holding space for my anxiety, I also make room for healing. The invitation is to notice the tension, breathe into it, and pivot toward openness, not as a demand, but as an offering to myself and to those who receive me. I think of this as a quiet revolution within, an unfolding of trust that blooms slowly from the interplay of patience, courage, and compassion. It is an act of profound grace to allow myself to be seen in fragments first, to reveal edges that are raw and real, and to invite others to meet me there without expectation or haste. This gentler unfolding becomes a balm, soothing the ache of past wounds and opening pathways toward connection that do not require surrendering safety, but honoring it. The path continues, winding through shadows and light, inviting me to keep tending with care. Each moment of presence, each small choice to stretch beyond fear, becomes a stitch in the tapestry of belonging. I hold this with quiet reverence. Trust is not a destination conquered, but a delicate process nurtured, a living thread weaving me closer to others, and, perhaps most importantly, to myself.